For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Surviving in a cold-weather wilderness is a brutal, unrelenting battle against nature. Every day is a fight for basic necessities, with the icy wind cutting through your bones and the relentless cold sapping your strength. In this frigid hell, your willpower is tested to its limits, and survival feels like a distant dream. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness, where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. The Yukon is one of North America's last great frontiers, known for its vast, rugged, and remote landscapes. Located in the northwest corner of Canada, the Yukon Territory is bordered by Alaska to the west, the Northwest Territories to the east, and British Columbia to the south. The Yukon wilderness in winter is a deadly, unforgiving expanse. The Yukon experiences a subarctic climate with long, harsh winters and short, warm summers. Temperatures plummet to lethal lows capable of freezing exposed skin in minutes. The snow and ice create a treacherous landscape where each step can lead to hidden crevasses or ice-covered rivers waiting to swallow the unwary. Frostbite and hypothermia are constant threats, sapping your strength and will to survive. The relentless cold penetrates even the warmest clothing, leaving you shivering and vulnerable. Wild animals, driven by hunger, roam the frozen terrain, adding to the peril. Isolation is profound, with rescue often a distant hope. In the Yukon's winter wilderness, every moment is a precarious dance with death. For Helen Klaben and Ralph Flores, their Yukon experience would be treacherous. In August 1962, Helen Klaben just turned 21 and had been drifting from job to job, unsure of what she wanted to do. While her friends were traveling in Europe, Helen decided to start by exploring America. She had never ventured far from her home in Brooklyn, and she wanted some adventure in her life. When she saw an ad in the newspaper from another young woman looking for a traveling companion, she jumped at the chance to travel to Alaska. While Alaska couldn't be any more different than New York, this place represented an adventure she needed, a place to find herself. So Helen and her new travel partner set out on a cross-country road trip from New York to Fairbanks. However, after a few months, the excitement died down. Helen was 4,000 miles from home, didn't find any jobs that excited her, and brutal Alaskan winters were getting to her. In January 1963, a group of Helen's friends sought warmer shores in Mexico. On a whim, she decided to go with them, but money was tight. When she saw an ad for a private flight to San Francisco at a fraction of the price of a regular ticket, she responded immediately. The pilot, 42-year-old Ralph Flores, was headed back to the Bay Area after finishing a job as an electrician in Fairbanks. He had an extra seat in his single-engine plane with the stipulation that he wanted to leave as soon as possible. Helen's first impression of Ralph was that he was soft-spoken and stoic. She wasn't quite sure what to make of him and was a little wary of his small single-engine plane. Helen didn't know much about planes, but it looked to be in fine condition. She pushed her fears aside and got ready to go. They flew the short trip from Fairbanks to Whitehorse, Canada, on February 1st, 1963. After landing, they were told the weather was too bad to continue to San Francisco, so they got a hotel room together. Helen was nervous about the weather, but Ralph looked her in the eye and asked if she trusted him. She said yes. He seemed to know what he was doing, and their trip from Fairbanks had gone smoothly. On February 4th, the weather improved slightly, and clearance was received to take off. Ralph put Helen in charge of the airway map and the radio facility chart. The takeoff was turbulent, and Ralph spiraled the plane upward through the clouds, relying on visual cues and radio navigation rather than updated systems, since he wasn't trained to use them. Helen's gut told her something was wrong. The weather worsened, and Ralph couldn't seem to rise above the clouds. Finally, they broke out over the clouds, and Helen's pulse slowed. But the respite was short-lived. Half an hour later, they were in even worse weather than before. Ralph was switched to the final fuel tank, with each tank carrying the plane for about 45 minutes. Helen glanced at the clock and did the math. They would run out of fuel by 3 o'clock. By 2:40, with only minutes to spare, Flores began to head down for an emergency landing. Everything below was a swirling gray mass. She watched the needle in the fuel gauge move closer and closer to empty. Then Ralph snapped at her, "The radio chart!" Radio navigation systems broadcast a signal along a narrow path. By tuning into the correct sequence of frequencies and listening for the signal, pilots can align themselves along the flight path from airport to airport. This method was the preferred air navigation technique before World War II, but was phased out beginning in the 1940s. However, Ralph Flores didn't see the need to upgrade. Helen held the radio range listing in front of Ralph as he steered the plane left and right, trying to find the navigational beam. For one brief, peaceful moment, he found it. Then it was lost again. Suddenly, a sharp wind ripped through the plane and tore the radio chart from Helen's hands. She and Ralph searched around the cabin, but they couldn't find it. It was as if the chart had vanished into thin air. Helen looked at the clock. It was 2:55. They would run out of fuel in 5 minutes or less. Helen watched as Ralph hunched over the panel, doing everything he could to slow the inevitable crash. The fuel gauge drifted lower and lower and finally hit zero. Helen thought to herself, well, here we go. She pulled her parka closer around her body, more for emotional comfort than for safety, and adjusted her seatbelt as tightly as she could. At the very last second, Ralph flipped a switch for the auxiliary gas tank. Helen felt her heart leap. She'd been worried for nothing. The engine began to sputter. Ralph had waited too long to switch tanks, desperate to use every ounce of gas. The plane began to drift downward. Before they knew it, they were plummeting toward the trees below. When Helen Klaben regained consciousness, the late afternoon sky glowed. She assessed her injuries. Her left arm was broken, her right foot was stuck, and in severe pain, her chin was split open and her face was bruised. The instrument panel was covered in blood, and Ralph lay under it, his seat detached, bleeding from his mouth. Fear gripped Helen. She softly called Ralph's name, worried he might be dead. After a few minutes, Ralph began to wake. He mumbled about wanting to sleep, his face severely smashed. Despite his injuries, he crawled out through a broken window, put on his parka, and assessed the situation. The plane had landed at a 45-degree angle, the front completely destroyed. Surrounded by tall, snow-covered trees, Ralph told Helen he had likely broken his jaw and ribs, then hobbled off to start a fire. While Ralph was gone, Helen tried to free her right foot. She noticed the thermometer read minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Ralph returned with wood, started a fire, and helped Helen exit the plane. Once on solid ground, he said, "You know why we're here, don't you? Because you reject Jesus Christ." Helen, remembering his previous attempts to convert her at the hotel, bit her tongue. Knowing a religious debate wouldn't help their situation. Night fell, and they were too injured to walk far. Their best hope was to wait for a search party, which was expected to be sent when they didn't arrive in San Francisco the next day. They settled in for the night, hoping for rescue in the morning. Helen tore open her bags, hoping to find warm clothes, but she'd packed for San Francisco, not the Yukon. None of her clothes were warm enough. They climbed back into the plane, huddled among the wreckage, and tried to sleep. In the morning, Helen and Ralph prepared for rescue. Ralph showed Helen how to use the radio, and her job became flagging down passing planes since her feet were too injured for physical tasks. Ralph collected firewood while Helen inventoried their food: 4 small cans of sardines, 2 cans of tuna, 2 cans of fruit salad, 1 box of saltines, a half bottle of protein pills, a half bottle of multivitamins, 5 pieces of chocolate, and 2 tablespoons of Tang. She was shocked at how little they had. When Ralph returned, Helen asked about emergency rations. Ralph admitted he hadn't packed any to save space. Helen then asked if he had insurance. Ralph confessed he didn't, thinking it was too expensive. Furious, Helen unleashed her anger at Ralph for his irresponsibility, yelling about the lack of food rations, no insurance, and dragging her into this mess. Though she knew yelling wouldn't help, it felt satisfying. Later in the day, they heard a plane overhead. Ralph fanned the campfire to create a smoke signal while Helen grabbed the radio mic and called, "Mayday, Mayday, we are alive. We need medical attention and food." She repeated the message on various frequencies, but the plane moved further away and then was gone. A massive search effort was underway based in Fort Nelson, British Columbia, but due to Ralph drifting from the planned route, the search planes might have been too far to pick up their broadcasts. Helen and Ralph heard no more planes that day. As night fell, they climbed back into the wreckage. Ralph, struggling with his broken ribs, tried to create more space in the plane. They padded the floor with spare clothes and stuffed blankets into broken windows. Ralph's suitcase was full of religious books, while Helen had packed Thoreau's Walden and Plato's Republic. Ralph read aloud from the Book of Mormon, but Helen, of Jewish descent, tired and frustrated, told him she wouldn't convert. Ralph, concerned, said they wouldn't be saved until she accepted Jesus Christ. Too exhausted to argue, Helen eventually put her book down and slept. The full reality hit Helen on the third day after the crash. Planes flew past, but none responded to their radio calls. The thick tree coverage likely hid their smoke signals. Hunger set in, and Helen felt the first pangs deeply. The mental and emotional toll of hunger made her question if Ralph was right about God punishing her. Though she knew it was the weather, his words gnawed at her. That night, overwhelmed, she cried in the plane. Ralph comforted her, assuring her of rescue, and helped splint her broken arm. She slept well, feeling less alone. The next morning, Ralph melted snow and they shared a small breakfast. Despite his jaw pain, Ralph remained determined. They talked about their families and redressed each other's wounds, avoiding discussing how bad they were. Ralph collected firewood, while Helen felt grateful for his efforts. Ralph tried fixing the watch, plane clock, and radio, and even set traps for rabbits, though unsuccessfully. The traps, made from suitcases and wires, amused Helen. A familial bond formed between them. Ralph, old enough to be her father, called her daughter, and she affectionately called him Daddy-O. Their routine provided comfort, but after a week, anxiety grew. By the 9th day, their rations were almost gone. On the 10th day, they ran out of food. By February 14, 1963, Helen Klaben and Ralph Flores had been stranded in the Yukon forest for 10 days. Both Helen and Ralph had enough body fat to keep them alive for a while. Helen spent the first 3 days doubled over with stomach cramps, but by the 4th morning she felt that her stomach had, in her own words, gone to sleep. The one thing Helen craved was water. Helen eagerly awaited the melted snow Ralph brought for water. However, they had to be careful not to drink too much, as it meant needing to remove layers of clothing to urinate in the sub-zero temperatures. Despite their situation, they tried to stay positive. They read aloud to each other, and Helen even started reading the Bible, finding some peace in the idea of God watching over them. Though she disagreed with Ralph's belief that accepting Christ was necessary for their rescue, finishing the Bible gave her a sense of purpose. By the 2nd week, Helen's right foot was in severe pain. Unwrapping it, she saw 3 blackened, blistered toes, clear signs of frostbite. Hope for rescue waned as Ralph gave up on the radio. Helen would hobble to a clearing to flash mirrors at passing planes, but without success. By the 3rd week, they hadn't heard a plane in days, leading Helen to worry that the search had been called off. Ralph reassured her that people would keep looking, but in reality, the search had been suspended after 2 weeks. A few days later, they heard another plane. Ralph and Helen created an SOS sign with oil paints she brought and hung it in a tree, but it was too small to be seen from above. Ralph decided to hang a larger sign higher up. Despite his injuries, he climbed a tree, risking further harm. From the top, he saw a river and clearing, possible routes for rescue. He descended, knowing they had to keep waiting. The cold and sleeplessness took their toll. It had been over 3 weeks since the crash and about 2 weeks without food. Helen wondered how much longer they could survive. Ralph estimated they had about 15 more days. Helen noticed Ralph's prayers had changed, and he seemed more vulnerable, even crying at times. To lift their spirits, Helen described a delicious meal her mother used to make, but the positivity was fleeting. Another week passed, and they had been stranded for nearly 5 weeks, out of food for 3. Their SOS sign remained unnoticed. Ralph decided it was time for his backup plan. He needed to venture into the forest to find help. They had relied on each other for survival, but now they had to split up. Helen couldn't walk through the knee-deep snow, and Ralph was weakening. The solution was snowshoes. Ralph improvised, using twigs and branches to create a lattice pattern. Despite his failed rabbit traps, Ralph believed he could make snowshoes work. As February turned to March, Ralph refined his snowshoe designs, getting closer to a functional pair. Helen watched with apprehension. She knew logically that Ralph had to search for help, but emotionally she feared being left alone. Day after day, Ralph chopped wood, boiled snow for drinking water, and worked on his snowshoes. One day he heard a faint machinery buzz, a sign of civilization. Ralph estimated it was around 30 miles or 48 kilometers away, doable with snowshoes. The next day, Ralph finished a working snowshoe model. He planned to travel toward the noise, searching for a highway or a clearing for a larger SOS sign. On March 7th, Ralph set out with a compass, spear, and snowshoes. However, the weight of the plane insulation in the sleeping bag made him too heavy for the fragile shoes. So he left the sleeping bag with Helen and took her coat as a blanket. Before leaving, he told Helen to direct rescuers to follow his tracks if they found her first. Helen wished him well, and Ralph disappeared into the forest. They called out each other's names until Ralph's voice faded away. Alone, Helen realized her fear of the dark as the sky darkened. Despite their differences, Ralph's presence had comforted Helen. Now alone, she faced her fear of the dark, jumping at every sound, fearing wild animals. With her broken feet, running wasn't an option. She wrapped herself in her sleeping bag, its warmth providing a sense of safety. She pushed away thoughts of danger and prayed for rescue, especially for Ralph. Meanwhile, Ralph slowly progressed through the snow, covering less than 3/4 of a mile or 1 kilometer. Realizing he wouldn't reach the source of the buzzing noise, he decided to find a clearing and lay out an SOS sign. He eventually found a charred area, indicating a forest fire had created a clearing. Setting up camp there, he planned to return for Helen. Despite his exhaustion, he built a shelter and prepared to head back. Helen hoped for a quick rescue. The next morning was the coldest yet. Changing her bandages, she noticed her frostbitten toes were black and shriveled, with bone pressing against the skin. Misinterpreting the pain as a sign of circulation, she rewrapped her feet, worried more about the rest of her body aching from the cold. She maintained her daily routine for structure and realized she had paper and pens. She began keeping a log, writing about her life and family, finding solace in the activity. On the 8th day after Ralph left, Helen was losing faith that he would ever come back. Her supply of firewood was dwindling, and she could hardly walk to collect more. She was lying in the plane reading when she heard something outside, deep in the woods, a voice calling, "Helen!" As soon as Ralph made it to the plane, she crawled over to hug and kiss him. He was exhausted and frail, but glad to see her too. While he started a fire, he told her about the clearing he had found and the shelter he had built. He had waited there for a while, but he couldn't stop thinking about her alone and defenseless at the plane. Ralph's new plan was to make a sort of makeshift toboggan out of the plane's fuselage and drag Helen to the new campsite since she could barely walk. They immediately started packing up as many useful materials as they could carry. Helen made a sign that said, "Went 2 miles downhill, March 16, 63, in case someone happened to find the plane without its passengers." As soon as the sun rose the next morning, they set off, but they didn't make it far. The toboggan was too heavy for Ralph to pull with all their essentials and Helen on board. She would have to walk with broken feet and no snowshoes. If Helen kept moving, the momentum was enough to push her along, but anytime she stumbled, which was often, she got stuck and couldn't move her right foot. Ralph had to help her get it moving again. The fuselage toboggan was less than sturdy and kept tumbling over, spilling their belongings into the snow. This sort of trek would be difficult enough if they were in perfect health, but they were weakened by injuries and starvation. After a few hours, they'd only made it half a mile, but reached the top of a steep hill. Once they made it to the bottom, the clearing wasn't far off. Helen looked down the slope. Her legs felt like jelly, and then Ralph told her to get in front of the toboggan and help guide it down. Helen carefully moved forward and grabbed the front of the long metal shell. She took one step and lost her balance, tumbling all the way to the bottom and landing in a cushion of snow. She lay there, disoriented, and watched Ralph chase the toboggan down the hill. When it reached the bottom, it sunk into a pile of fresh snow. There was only one more hill to make it over, but without the toboggan, they would have to carry everything themselves. They loaded up their arms and kept going. The final stretch was the most difficult. When Helen made it to the top of the hill, her body collapsed. After a total of 5 hours, they finally made it the full 3/4 of a mile to the clearing. Ralph brushed the snow off the little cabin he'd built, started a fire, and immediately fell asleep. When Helen woke the next morning, as Ralph was chopping firewood, he was struck by abdominal spasms that sent him crumbling to the ground. He had put up a good show of strength, but the exhaustion and starvation were clearly taking their toll. Between swings of the axe, he kept rambling about how they wouldn't be rescued until Helen accepted Christ. Helen didn't say anything. She knew Ralph might not make it much longer. They might as well make the best of the time they had left. He told her about his plan to walk to a frozen pond he had seen a short distance away. There was enough space to shovel out a giant SOS in the snow. If their campsite didn't catch a pilot's attention, that definitely would. Helen thought it was a bad idea for him to set off on his own in his current condition, but it was no use arguing. The next morning, Ralph strapped on his snowshoes and Helen was alone once again. She settled back into her routine of reading, daydreaming, and counting the days she'd spent in the tundra, now at 47 days. They were long past the original 15 days Ralph had estimated they could survive without food. Miraculously, they were both still alive, but they wouldn't stay that way much longer. On day 48, 4 days after Ralph set out for the lake, Helen finally completed her goal of reading the entire Bible. As she turned the last page of the book of Revelation, she felt a strange bit of hope dying inside her. She hadn't really believed God would save them when she finished the Bible as Ralph had suggested, but it had been nice to dream about. And then she heard it. A plane. Ralph Flores surveyed his work. A giant SOS shoveled into the snow with an arrow pointing to the campsite a few miles south. It was designed to catch a pilot's eye, but no planes had passed for weeks. After 8 days by the frozen pond, Ralph finally saw a plane. He flashed a small mirror to catch the pilot's attention, but a muscle spasm hit him. When he looked up, the plane was gone, heading toward the clearing where Helen was waiting. Helen rushed out, dumped pine needles into the campfire to create thick smoke, and waved the canvas tent to reveal their plane's identification number. Miraculously, the plane turned and circled back. Helen fell to the ground, weeping, as the plane's wings signaled it had seen her. After 48 days, Ralph and Helen were finally found. The pilot, Chuck Hamilton, had noticed both Ralph and Helen. He assumed they were trappers who'd run low on supplies, a common sight in the Yukon. But then he noticed the number painted on the canvas, N5886, the same plane that had gone down 48 days ago. No one thought Helen and Ralph could still be alive, but here they were. Hamilton reached for his radio. He announced in shock, "I think I found the lost people." He immediately flew to the closest landing point, a trapper lodge just 10 miles north. The source of that mysterious buzz-saw noise Ralph had heard weeks earlier. The sky was already darkening, so Chuck would have to wait until morning to fly back for the woman in the clearing, but he told the trappers that if they hurried, they might be able to reach the man on the pond before nightfall. They readied their dog sleds and raced into the forest. As night fell, Ralph heard a muffled noise in the distance. He called for help, but they'd stopped somewhere far off in the trees. The snow cover was so thick that the trappers had to leave the sled behind and walk to him on snowshoes. They were coming, just slowly, too slowly. The last light of dusk was fading. Soon it would be too dark to see anything. Ralph sat alone in the dark, waiting. It slowly sank in that the trappers had gotten lost somewhere in the trees. They wouldn't be able to find him until morning. When dawn broke the next morning, Helen heard a plane approaching. It swooped low and the pilot dropped a small package out of the window. It landed in a snowdrift. She scrambled over and opened it up. 2 chocolate bars, cigarettes, some gum, and a little note that said, "Good morning. There are 2 other planes on the way." A couple of miles away, the trappers finally made it through the trees and found Ralph. They brought him some moose meat and a whole loaf of sourdough bread, which he tore into at the speed of light. They rushed him to the dog sled, then back to the cabin. Knowing that rescue was on the way, Helen tried to make herself presentable by cleaning her nails and brushing her hair. It was a lost cause. Then suddenly, a man on snowshoes came gliding into the clearing. Helen burst into tears. When he got close enough, she hugged and kissed him. He shyly introduced himself as Jack McCallum. Jack had landed his plane about 3 miles away. Once Chuck Hamilton and a few other rescuers arrived, they had to figure out how to get Helen back to the plane. Chuck said he could easily carry her on his back. This surprised Helen, who didn't realize her weight had plummeted to barely 100 pounds. Before they set off, Chuck asked if she was ready. She replied, "Sure," with a smile. Chuck said, "You better be. They've spent over $1.5 million looking for you." They flew back to the trapper's cabin where Ralph was already sitting by the fire sipping a warm cup of tea. It was March 25th, 1963, 49 days after the crash, and somehow Ralph and Helen had both survived. The next day, the 2 survivors were whisked off to a hospital in nearby Whitehorse, Canada. Astonished reporters were already gathered to catch a glimpse of the survivors. While the nurses were looking her over, Helen asked if she could call her mother. When she picked up, Helen yelled, "Ma, I'm alive! I feel delightful. There are millions of photographers here." The doctors estimated that Helen might have survived a week longer in the wilderness at most. She had lost 40 pounds and all 5 toes on her right foot. Ralph was in even worse shape. He only would have made it about 4 more days. When Ralph saw his scarred face in the mirror with his fractured jaw and dislodged teeth, he said, "My wife will collapse when she sees me." But Helen focused on the positives. The only thing that bothered her was that her toes needed to be amputated, which meant an extended hospital stay. She was desperate to get home to her family, so she asked the doctors if she could get the toes removed once she was back in New York. They agreed. Ralph, meanwhile, was awaiting the results of a Canadian Department of Transport investigation into the crash. Failure to carry regulation survival gear was punishable by up to a $5,000 fine and a year in jail. However, a department spokesperson stated that he had never heard of charges being brought in a case like this, noting, "It is usually felt the pilot has learned a lesson from his experience." In the end, Ralph's license to fly was revoked, but he didn't face any additional punishment. When Helen's brother Arthur arrived on March 29th, she was glad to see him. She couldn't stop crying and laughing as she embraced him. Ralph's wife, by chance, flew into Whitehorse on the same flight. She told reporters, "I can't explain it in words, but all this time I knew he would be found. I feel strongly that the only thing that saved him was his faith." On their last day together, Helen went to Ralph's room to say goodbye. Helen said she'd go out to California one day to meet Ralph's family, but they both knew it would never really happen. Their 53 days together had been an intense experience, but this chapter of their lives was ready to close. Suddenly, Ralph's face grew serious. He said, "Remember what you have to do." Helen knew what he meant, accepting Jesus. She kissed him on the head and said, "Goodbye, Daddy-O." When she arrived home in New York, she was swarmed by reporters begging to hear how she'd survived. Less than a week after being rescued, the toes of her frostbitten right foot were amputated. She soon began writing her book about her ordeal. Hey, I'm Alive, published in 1964, which was made into a television movie. During the production of the movie in 1975, this would be the first time Ralph and Helen saw each other since the ordeal, as they were advisors for the movie. They stayed friends until his death in 1997. Helen would later marry and have 2 kids. Helen Klaben died on December 2nd, 2018, at her home in Palo Alto, California, of histiocytic sarcoma, a rare blood cancer. She was 76. Initially, Helen Klaben wasn't sure what she'd learned from her ordeal in the Yukon wilderness. She still felt like the same old Helen, the girl who jumped from job to job and coast to coast without a plan. But she finally settled on an answer. Surviving in the Yukon had taught her patience. It had taught her that some things simply can't be changed. Sub-zero temperatures, frostbitten feet, and a born-again Mormon constantly pressuring her to convert. She had to accept the circumstances she was in and figure out how to endure them. More than anything, though, Helen felt the crash had taught her to be grateful for what she had. In her own words, "I discovered something else I never knew before. I love life. All of a sudden I see I have a message for the world. The message is love." A winter that does not relent upon any, but instead strips away their comforts, leaving one only with the core instincts to survive. But deep down in the core of this brutal struggle, there's the profound truth that the human spirit is powerful. The wilderness is indifferent, a harsh and unforgiving teacher, yet one who reveals your strength and resourcefulness. Every challenge in this frozen expanse is hard-fought and ultimately victorious. It teaches you how to dig deeper, hit harder, and find fierce determination from within. In the silence of snow-covered solitude, you realize that survival is not only in enduring the elements, but by welcoming the inner strength rising in the face of adversity. Surviving in a cold-weather wilderness after a plane crash is a dire situation. If you happen to survive the plane crash, being resourceful and staying calm improves your chances. Address any immediate medical needs, perform first aid if necessary. Take stock of any supplies you have, including food, water, clothing, and medical supplies. Look for natural formations such as caves, rock overhangs, or dense thickets for shelter. If the plane is still intact and you're sure the threat of fire from the fuel is over, use the fuselage for shelter. Use all available clothing to layer up. Retain body heat by keeping clothes dry and avoiding sweating. Use leaves, pine needles, or other natural materials to create insulation for your body. Start a fire as soon as possible for warmth, to dry clothes, and to signal for help. Gather dry wood and tinder and keep the fire maintained. Use bright colors, smoke from a fire, or large ground signals like an SOS made from rocks or branches to attract attention. Use a whistle, mirror, or any reflective object to signal rescuers. Melt snow or ice for drinking water. Learn to identify edible plants, berries, and insects to eat. If you have the means, consider fishing or trapping small animals for food. Watch for signs of hypothermia and frostbite. If rescue seems likely, it's often better to stay near the crash site. If you must move, try to find a path to safety using landmarks and natural indicators like rivers leading to civilization. By following these tips and remaining calm and resourceful, you increase your chances of surviving an outdoor disaster. Thank you for watching. Want more outdoor disaster content? Check out these stories I believe you'll enjoy.